You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Schatten. Before we get started with today's guest, just a note, if you have questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at Jeff Schatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it. My guest this week is Susan Cain. Susan is the chief revolutionary of Quiet Revolution and the author of the bestseller Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, which has been translated into 40 languages, is in its 7th year on the New York Times bestseller list, and was named the #1 best book of the year by Fast Company magazine, which also named Cain one of its most creative people in business. LinkedIn named her the 6th top influencer in the world. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. Her record-smashing TED Talk has been viewed over 20 million times and was named by Bill Gates as one of his all-time favorite talks. Cain was named one of the world's top 50 leadership and management experts by Inc. magazine. I hope you enjoy our conversation on personality, introversion, and the ways in which workplaces can take advantage of a dynamic range of employee personalities. I'd like to welcome Susan Cain to the podcast. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
In business schools and as well as in the broader world, there's this idea of the extrovert ideal. Can you comment just like why?
Oh, yeah. So why do we have the extrovert ideal in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
It really goes back to the history of the country, which is in the 19th century, we lived in what historians called a culture of character, where people judged each other based on who they were, what they perceived each other's moral fiber to be. And that system worked really well in a country where people were living in small towns alongside people they had known all their lives. But what happened was we got to the turn of the 20th century. People started moving out of their towns into cities, away from farms and into corporations to sustain themselves. And so suddenly what became really important was, could you make a good first impression on other people? How did you show up at a job interview? How did you show up when you were selling your sewing machines or whatever you were traveling around selling? And then at the same time, there was the growth of the cinema. So like people were struggling with these questions all week long at work, and then they would go to the movies during the weekend and be confronted with these larger than life images of movie stars who would kind of show them how to be the charismatic, likable person. And so that was when we moved into what historians call a culture of personality. And we're still really living in that culture today. So, if you look at our workplaces, yes, it's true, as you say, there's all kinds of research suggesting that we need introverts and extroverts. We need them working well together. The best teams are composed of both types. But if you think about the kind of snapshots of your typical day in a workplace, they're still snapshots of personality. It's still like.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that you're going to if you're an entrepreneur, your fortunes are determined by how do you show up at a pitch meeting. If you're a lower level employee, a white collar employee, it's still how do you show up in the meeting? How much are you contributing? How well are you making your presence felt? Do you own the room? These kinds of questions, the kinds of skills that are involved with showing up well in those settings should be really like just one skill among many, right, that determine like what kind of value you might add. But what ends up happening is that those skills have a disproportionate value.
Right, because within a given project, right, I mean, there's the pitch, but the majority of what you're doing, if you're a consultant, let's say, to win the contract, there's going to require a lot of face time. It's going to require a public face, a presentation. But once a contract is won, it's a lot of diligence. It's a lot of it's a lot of individual work.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's absolutely right. It's just we're in this strange place where we have these cognitive distortions, I think. I was talking to a friend of mine who evaluates VC pitches. He's a private equity guy, and he says that he's always amazed. He's actually somebody who I think does see the difference between these things, but he says he's amazed by the extent to which he sees many of his colleagues in the industry be really swayed by the very charismatic presenter and not be focused as much on the substance in that moment. I think it's probably a very human thing, right? We use these kinds of heuristics of who we're going to trust and who we believe can get the job done, and we look for the person who presents with a lot of smooth confidence.
So in the ideal teams, we have a phrase we call dominance complementarity, which is that we want a balance between dominant and submissive members. And extroverts, they tend to feel more comfortable speaking extemporaneously. They're comfortable giving opinions without complete information.
Yep.
And they can sometimes just end up as the center of the universe in the decision-making process. And in organizational behavior, we think of team decision-making as fundamentally being an information asymmetry issue. So that imagine that you're in a team that's making a very difficult decision, and there's 7 people on that team. Oftentimes, there's 3 or 4 that have vital information, and it's very difficult to get that information out of them. And it tends to be that the extroverts, and maybe the other 3 or 4 in the room, are sucking up all the attention and all the input. So what can leaders do within those kind of settings to ensure that the voices of introverts are better heard?
Yeah, no, it's an enormous problem. And you're probably familiar with the statistic that came out of the Kellogg School. I think it was a couple of years ago that found that in your typical meeting, you have 3 people doing 70% of the talking.
Right.
So, which is exactly what you're getting at. So what can you do about it? Well, we can talk about some tips for what you can do like in the meeting itself, but I think that the work starts earlier than that. It really starts deep within each team of people who are working closely together. And I always go in and I talk to a lot of companies, and I always counsel them to get teams talking about what their underlying personality styles are, particularly introversion, extroversion. Get them talking about it in a way so that it becomes an everyday discussion. And I have on my website, quietrev.com, everything on there is free, including a free personality test that people can use, which is a great way to just quickly get people to kind of take the test and open up the discussion from there. And once you have everybody on the team kind of comfortably talking about, well, am I an introvert? Am I an extrovert? The next question is to get people talking about what, as an introvert, as an extrovert, what are my needs for how I best get my work done and how I can best contribute my thoughts to this group? What are the best ways of doing that? What are the ways in which I'm most comfortable, and what are the ways that each individual team member can help the other to do that? So if you have somebody who is less comfortable, let's say, advancing ideas in that kind of a setting, well, maybe you want to be talking to them about important stuff one-on-one instead of, I think what most company cultures would do would be to say, well, everybody's got to kind of step up and get their ideas out there. And yeah, we all should. We'll talk in a second about ways to do that. But what really matters is the ideas themselves, right? And and so scheduling one-on-ones, if that's the way to do it. Once you're actually sitting in a meeting, it can be really helpful to, well, actually, let me say this before you get to the meeting. it's not really enough to just kind of like throw out an agenda, distribute it to everybody 1 minute before, and work from that. You're much better off having a really thoroughly prepared process, because I love what I hear about the way Amazon works, where they have before the meeting, the person calling it is responsible for putting together a long memo, which is really carefully thought out, and then everybody spends the first half an hour of the meeting apparently like sitting and reading the memo before
which is very entertaining, the idea of Jeff Bezos sitting around reading this memo. Apparently part of it is that they found that people just don't do enough homework.
Yeah.
So when they were putting together this idea, they found that people just were not pre-reading well enough.
Right.
That people were just skimming documents. And so if you get everybody in the room, and obviously these are for really high stakes decisions, you get a well thought out, I think they have like a 5-6 page is their target. And then, and then everybody sits around and reads it.
Yeah. Yeah. But, it's funny because like when that Amazon way gets talked about in the press, it's talked about as a matter of homework and thoughtful decision making. And it is those things, but it's also fantastic for these dynamics because it ensures that the extroverts are doing the work they need, so they're not thinking out loud and just on the fly, right?
Right.
And with insufficient information. And the introverts are getting the pre-work that they need to be comfortable actually voicing their ideas. Because what introverts always say is, by the time I thought of the thing I wanted to say, the meeting was over. So this is a way of short-circuiting that problem. But there's another fantastic technique that actually comes from the world of education, of school teachers, and it's called Think, Pair, Share. And the way it works in schools is that teachers will throw out a question like, what do you think went wrong between the Montagues and the Capulets? It could be anything. And then you have the students assigned into pairs. They each first sit and think quietly about what they think is the answer to the question. Maybe they write down their thoughts to organize them. Then they talk with their pair member about each other's ideas, and that has a way of kind of opening everything up for both the introverts and the extroverts. And then the teacher will ask the students to share it out with the class. And you get a lot more participation from introverted students with that technique because they've now already kind of loosened things up and articulated their ideas, so they're much more likely to share it out. And that works just as well in a corporate setting.
And so do you see companies doing that who are or some form of that where are there boards or teams that you're working with that you see where they are consciously addressing the fact that there's 30 to 50% of the group that's not really being heard from?
Oh my gosh, I would say of the companies I have spoken with over these years, that is probably the number one concern that I hear from every single one of them. And they all feel as if they're unique. But I hear the same thing from all the different companies. And sometimes small tweaks can go a long way. Like I'll give you an example. I often advise, when I'm speaking with companies, I'm often speaking to a mix of introverts and extroverts, and I'll often advise the introverts in the room to do this hack, the following hack when they go into meetings, which is to think in advance of the thing that you might want to say or the question you might want to raise, and then to give yourself a push to speak up early in the meeting, with the idea being that the people who speak up early, their ideas become anchors, and they also become kind of emotional anchors in the room, and other people start directing their comments to them, their eye contact to them. And it's a lot easier once you feel emotionally in the center to kind of run with that. And it's not to say you can't get there later, that you can't speak later on if you've felt more and more on the margins, but it's just easier if you start that way. And so I'm giving this advice, and I often hear back from companies that's become a kind of thing within the company. Like everybody is urging each other to do that and talking about it as they go into meetings.
The first mover advantage.
What's that? Yeah, first mover advantage. Exactly. So I often think the good news with a lot of this stuff is that that raising awareness of it and making small tweaks around it, it's not going to solve the problem, but it can go a long way towards making things better. Just these small transitions, these small changes. I mean.
So yeah, I just want to kind of get back to the information asymmetry problem, which is so in a company setting, it's really different than a classroom, right? So when I teach an organizational behavior class, there are some students whose voices might be heard, might not be heard, and of course you want all voices to be heard, but everybody kind of has access to a similar amount of information, right? They're, for me at least, they're undergrads or maybe of MBA students, and you have a group of 40, 50 students, and if one or two students in reality isn't heard from, the class is going to be okay. But in a corporate setting or a company setting, you'll have people around the room that have vital information and they're the only one that has access to that information. Right? We can imagine a group where there's somebody within who's representing the finance wing who has knowledge about some risk with a debt instrument that they have, and that if they don't raise that, it really does impact the overall decision. And one of the biggest challenges is getting all that information out. It's not easy. When you have a bunch of people, right, usually very talented, very smart people that are pressed for time in a meeting that is going to end, and then getting the multiple voices out there. And the thing is, when you go in a priori, you don't know who has the voice or the knowledge set that you need access to in order to make a decision.
Yeah, no, it's a great example that you just gave. And for that example specifically, but what I'm going to say applies really in general. One of the things you want to do that for the person running the meeting is to make it socially comfortable for people to offer dissenting opinions and to voice risks, especially if you're operating in a culture where the mode is to be gung-ho and not to be the Cassandra in the room talking about what the risks might be. You want to kind of structurally build it in that it's okay to do that. So for the person running the meeting to say, okay, we're all excited about this, but let's spend a minute talking about what the possible downsides might be. Even if you don't believe in those downsides, can I hear from somebody about what they are? I just want someone to make that argument for the sake of making it. And that way you're kind of divorcing that then invites people to be able to voice whatever argument or concern they might have without necessarily attaching themselves to it. And I think that there's often there's a reluctance to do things like this because it feels to people like it feels like emotionally babying people or something. But
right.
But I think that viewing it that way is just not being realistic about human dynamics. The fact is, there are all kinds of impediments to speaking up, and there's work done that found that when people dissent from group opinion in a meeting, that the amygdala, which is the part of your brain that registers fear and discomfort and just sort of negative emotion in general, your amygdala becomes extremely activated during those moments. Neuroscientists call that the pain of independence. So it's not babying people. It's basically being really smart about making adjustments for a human quirk. So you want to kind of take away the pain of independence and invite people to take that spot.
So, I mean, should somebody who recognizes that they're introverted, should they just fake it, just through some self-talk, fake extroversion, if they're in a situation that needs it?
I mean, I yes, but I wouldn't use that framework for thinking about it. I would only because I think that's a disempowering framework to think,
Sure.
Okay, I've got to fake being someone who I'm not. But you can instead think, okay, I'm going to be this version of myself for this particular situation. I'm going to be the amped up version of myself, let's say, or I'm going to be the version of myself that is a little more confrontational than usual, or whatever happens to be called for. And I think it can be really helpful to look around your world for role models of people who have a temperamental style that's similar to yours and are wielding it very successfully, and channel those people as opposed to channeling someone who's not like you at all. And I'll give you an example just to make this concrete. So, these days I'm actually really comfortable with public speaking, and I do it for a living, which is kind of crazy to my former self of 10 or 20 years ago that used to hate public speaking. So when I first started, and when I was starting as an author, and I knew I was going to be going out on the speaker circuit, my MO was not to look for role models who are sort of showman type speakers, because that's not me, and it's never who I'm going to be. And I knew that. So for me, my model back then was Malcolm Gladwell, who is a fellow author and also self-described introvert, and he's a brilliant speaker. And he speaks by being very, he has compelling information, and he's thoughtful, and he tells interesting stories about it. And I thought, okay, that's something I can do. That makes sense to me. And so having that in my mind as a prototype when I was first starting out was incredibly useful. And I think that's really the way to go.
So, given that, how malleable do you think personality is, right? You're talking about kind of how you've developed over time. So are you in the camp that personality is pretty stable, or that it can change in terms of the power of the situation?
Well, yes and no. I'm in the camp that it's fundamentally stable, but with a big but, which actually two big buts. One of them is that you can acquire skills over time. So your underlying personality may not be changing, but you can develop so many skills that it feels like a personality change. Because, if you were the person who never gave speeches before, or was never comfortable in at networking events, but then you develop the skill of how to do that, your pathway in the world changes, even though you're still the same fundamental human. So I focus on skills in that way. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I do believe that you can strategically change in situations, and I draw a lot on the work of the professor Brian Little, who you might be familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So he talks about free trait theory, and his idea is that we all have what he calls core personal projects, which is the work that we really care about, or the people we really love, and in the service of those core personal projects, that is when we can best and really should best step out of character. And so,
what do you mean? Like, what's an example of that?
Okay, I'll give you an example. Like, I'm not someone who loves throwing big parties, but I threw my husband a gigantic surprise 50th birthday party. And I invited like everybody he'd ever known in his whole life and organized this whole thing. So it's not a me thing to do. It's not my personality to throw that kind of party, but it was a core personal project to do it. And so, for the sake of him and that birthday and that party, I stepped outside my normal character. And you can do it, right? When it matters, and especially when it matters so much to you, those are the moments that you're usually most effective at doing it. And you can do that in your work life also. If you're an introverted entrepreneur, let's say, and this is your moment to be pitching to VCs, that might be the moment where you really amp it up at the presentational meeting and you give the most amped up version of yourself, and you do it because you care so much. But the key part, the other key part of Professor Little's theory is that only works if you also give yourself restorative niches, which is to say, okay, after that 50th birthday party or after that extremely amped up pitch meeting, you get to come home and chill out and maybe go get a massage or be in a room by yourself for the next 5 hours. And you schedule that into your day and honor that commitment to yourself to recharge just as fiercely as you would honor your commitments to your clients and your family.
Right, because we can imagine somebody who's an extreme extrovert and they need the same thing, right? That their tendency is they find happiness and they draw their energy by being around other people. But there are times that they need to do something that is entirely introverted for maybe even a few days. But then they can make an agreement with themselves that afterwards they'll go back to their social activities or whatever it is that they do that they draw energy from.
Yes, I hear that a lot. And by the way, like we're talking a lot about how most companies are structured around the extrovert ideal. So it would be introverts who are the ones who are kind of faced with these challenges more often. But I do hear from extroverts too, sometimes who work in lab groups or whatever it is, where the tech groups where the dominant mode is much more introverted. And they start to go a little bit nuts, and they're the ones who have to figure out, how do I compensate here?
Interesting. Yeah, and so part of this, I guess, is culturally bound, right? I've spent a lot of time lecturing in China, and when you think of, I guess, the Hofstede dimension of individualism versus collectivism, and I guess it somewhat corresponds with extroversion and introversion. The U.S. is really high on extroversion, high on individualism, and we think of the Asian countries. The one I'm most familiar with is China, which is much more collectivist and much more introverted. And a lot of these values seem to be culturally bound, and likewise even within the United States, and in a more tech geek area, let's say in Silicon Valley. You might have a higher introverted ideal. So how do you think through some of these cultural issues and how people make sense of their personality within a given cultural context?
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting because there's so many different layers to where your personality comes from, as you're suggesting, and some of it is biological and some of it is cultural, and then also your experiences and what happens to you. So I actually devoted a whole chapter of my book to looking at Asian cultures and how they differ, particularly from the U.S. and the West in general. There was one woman who I interviewed. She had come to the U.S. from China. She's one of the most innately extroverted people I've ever met. Kind of like a really jolly, out there person. But she came from China, and she came here for grad school. And she said that when she first got here, like, she couldn't believe the extent to which the students would just raise their hands and then do what she called talking nonsense. She was like, she said the students would just talk nonsense over and over again. And she said, and the more nonsense they would talk, the more the professors would nod their heads respectfully. And and she said, so I just learned that was all I had to do in a U.S. classroom.
That's funny.
And for her, that was actually comfortable, not the nonsense part, but the chatting part. But yeah, I think that happens all the time.
It was a big shock for me. The first time I taught a class in China, and I had a class of 50 students.
Right.
And the first time that I asked just a very easy open-ended question and had no hands, I thought I had done something wrong.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm sure you've talked to students about this. I did a lot of interviews around this, and what I heard over and over was they wouldn't have raised their hands in that situation because they would have felt it was disrespectful to you and to their fellow students to take up others' time with their own comments, which were probably not going to be that valuable. Like that would be the way you would see it. And yeah, I remember interviewing a student at Harvard Business School, and he was amazed by it was a Chinese student, I should have said, and he was amazed by his classmates' ability to, like he said, they'd go to the supermarket and they would somehow manage to turn that excursion to the supermarket into some compelling story that they would then share with their classmates and feel was worth other people's time. and it was worth their time because they turned it into something funny. But that runs so deeply against the way you would be trained in a more collectivist society, which would be like, don't use other people's time with something that's irrelevant.
So maybe taking the Harvard example, which is, the Harvard Business School really sets the tone for really the country's business education in many ways, and it kind of, I guess, loops us back to our original question about this extroverted ideal. What do you think business schools and maybe education more broadly should be doing in terms of, this Harvard ideal that extroversion is better? I don't know if that's fair to say, but I think it's probably, it seems to be ubiquitous in at least business education.
I think it's fair to say. I spent a whole chapter of my book on HBS because a friend of mine who had graduated from there called it the spiritual capital of extroversion. He said, you've got to go check it out. And so I went and I just sort of plopped down there for about a week and just hung out and talked to students and professors. It was like anthropologically the most fascinating place I think I've ever been. I literally thought of applying as a student there so I could write a whole book about it.
There's a book I recommend called My HBS Experience, My 2 Years in the Cauldron of Capitalism, where a journalist does that.
I've got to read that one.
Really good. Okay, but go on. So how do people manage? How do introverts or people on that end of the spectrum manage at HBS?
They have a really, really tough time of it at HBS. There's just so much pressure there. And it's not only about speaking up in class where they're graded, at least when I was there, they were graded 50% of their grade was based on class participation. But that's really only the start of it. It's also that you're supposed to do all of your prep for class and study groups. And then even when you're not in your study group, you're supposed to be going out every night and all these elaborate social excursions that take place nightly, but they also take place on your vacations. So you're supposed to spend your vacation with your fellow students hiking up Mount Kilimanjaro or chartering some sailboat and going somewhere. Like it's kind of nonstop. So like people talk about that they go out at night as if it's their job, and if they don't show up one evening, everybody's asking, where were you? So there's really the expectation, explicit and implicit, that this is the way you are in business. This is what you need to do to be successful. I will say, I spoke to a professor at HBS a year or two ago, I think, and she told me that when she had first started teaching and she would introduce her students to the MBTI, the test that helps you, Myers-Briggs, that helps you figure out your personality style. She said when she first started, nobody wanted to admit to being an introvert. Like they all sort of pretended that they were extroverts. And she said that has really changed now in recent years, and people are claiming introversion. So I've been really happy to see that. And I feel like I've noticed that change happening across society in general.
Because if you look at, if you look at the stuff that Harvard Business Review is putting out, it is very sophisticated and looks at extroversion, introversion, how to manage teams and how to pull out voices. I mean, there does seem to be a split between kind of the applied side of how it actually trickles down to students in a lot of universities versus what's coming out in publications.
I think that's right. Because I think that people are starting to get this on a cognitive level, if not on a cultural one. And the cultural change always lags a little bit behind, right? It's like as with any bias, the first step is to noticing that the bias exists, and then the second step is to correcting it in all the places that it appears that aren't always obvious. Like the fact that there's social pressure to take your spring break hiking up Mount Kilimanjaro with 17 other students. Well, what exactly does that mean, and what are you going to do with it? But it does affect people's daily lives and how they think about themselves and each other.
Right. All right. I think we're about out of time, so I want to just thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been an honor to have you on.
Oh, you are so welcome, and thank you for having me. It was really fun to talk to you. I don't get to talk that often in interviews with people who really know all the literature the way you do and are coming at it from this perspective. So this was so much fun for me.
Great. Thanks so much for coming on. Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffschatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffschatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.